And welcome back to Out of the Bag, live on MSI Radio, msiradio.com, where we are seeking solutions. And thank you very much to Vin Byrne for coming on for the first hour of my show. It was a great chat. I hope you enjoyed it. And I'm now inviting onto Out of the Bag, Freemanjack. Are you with me?
Good evening, Sean.
Okay.
Do you remember the traditional Freemanjack profanity warning, or would you like me to issue it?
Well, I actually said there'd be adult content at the beginning of the show. You were probably asleep at the time, but I can go ahead and tell people.
This is Freemanjack appearing on Sean's Out of the Bag, and as usual, we'll be discussing adult topics with adult language. So if you're easily offended, best you, tune in a back catalogue of EastEnders or something. Far less offensive than me.
Oh, yeah, but it'll twist your mind a lot worse.
Okay, well, I suppose we ought to turn to the subject of tonight's show.
Yeah.
Have you got the show blog there, just to save me being too wordy? Because your summation of my suggested topic for the evening, I think, was a wonderfully literary piece.
Oh, well, thank you very much. I'll read the blog out, shall I?
Yes, please.
Sean Maguire will be talking to Freemanjack. Well, I am. This week's show deals with sexual orientation and taboo. Jack and Sean will be discussing how we form our own individual sexual identity, our influences and cultural conditioning, consensual sexual relationships, along with the deviances within the confines of such consent will be covered, and the often ignored subject of sexual violence and its possible roots. If time allows, Wilhelm Reich's work on orgastic and neurotic biological responses and the work of Alfred Kinsey will be given a brief and rare outing on radio, adult content, and a show not to be missed. So that's basically my blog.
Outing being a very appropriate word to use for Kinsey.
Yes, let's out the person.
Yes, shall we? Essentially, what we have with the work of the contrast between the works of Wilhelm Reich. He was called by Freud the father of psychoanalysis. He was actually a student of Freud, and he went on to extend the realm of human knowledge into not just human sexual behaviour, but all sexual behaviour, the actual nature of sex itself and of sexual excitation.
They sort of split after a while, didn't they, with Freud going down the libido route, and I suppose Wilhelm going down the sort of energy route.
Very much so, and Reich's research being driven by an incredible experimental path, and Reich really was the consummate scientist, and he never really considered himself to be of a particular field of research. And so if a particular field of research led him into having to investigate some other completely different area of science in order to understand his current field of research, then so be it. And consequently, his research into the human mind and human behaviour led him to understanding that it would be impossible to truly grasp what the base motives were of a complex animal like a mammal, a high-order mammal. And so he took the scientific approach and used Occam's razor and basically pared down biological responses to their most simplistic form and began the study of amoebas and some little sort of proto-life forms called bions.
Yes. Yeah.
And what came out of his bion and amoebic researches were that the physical behaviour of living organisms was essentially an electromagnetic interaction, an electromagnetic interplay. He saw with the amoeba the tentative extending of a tentacle out in a single direction, and depending on what met the tip of that tentacle, whether it was beneficial or potentially hazardous, would predict whether or not the amoeba basically poured itself into that tentacle or retracted that tentacle and poured itself in the other direction. A sort of push-pull, attraction-repulsion. On finding this, he then realised that, of course, he couldn't attach an electrode to an amoeba and actually find out what the physiological responses were that were driving this behaviour. So he then had to kind of zoom back out of the sort of fractal zoom and reapply his work to humans. And what he found was that the electrical conductivity of the skin that's used in lie detectors traditionally to detect changes in emotional state were very applicable for the field of human psychological research, and especially into the realms of sexual research, because it meant that he had a quantitative way of measuring biological activity, biological stimulation, sexual stimulation. He could actually measure a woman's arousal on a voltmeter, which may seem a little perverse to us non-kind of scientific types, but this was absolutely what was needed in order to understand the biological functions, the kind of erection and the biological readiness for sex, which is all, part and key to it, that all of these areas needed to be measured. And as part of these measurements, what he began to understand was that there were two opposing biological forces. One, he used a common word that we're all comfortable with, and that's neurotic. But the way that he used that word is similar in the way that Tom Campbell uses the word love. He used neurotic as a very strict scientific biological definition. So he wasn't saying that an amoeba is behaving neurotically when it retracts from a potential threat. It's simply that it is in retraction. Yeah. Yes. And so the concept of neurosis and of neuroticism is one of introspection or inversion. And in counterpoint to that, he then described the outward flow, the externalization, as orgastic. Now, this caused an awful lot of problems because of the similarity of the word to orgasm and because of his biological connection to orgastic and orgasmic. Yeah,
even though Jack, we're organisms.
Yeah, I mean, specifically, the problem was that he was applying the sensations and the biology of orgasm to everything, to all life, to every living day.
Yes, yes.
And essentially, he began to diagnose problems with his patients by identifying whether they were fixatedly neurotic or overtly orgastic. And both of these could be a problem. Essentially, what all of Reich's work basically describes yin and yang and chi energy, but he hadn't studied any Eastern philosophies. He's basically discovering how you can measure sort of chi energy and describe yin and yang in a scientific term and apply that to a therapeutic regime where even if these are only kind of hangers that we hang a theory on, that they're very applicable and they're very powerful tools. So again, I don't know necessarily that Reich would have said that these were absolutes or worked with these as absolutes. These would have been therapeutic tools. These would have been ways of considering the behaviours of a patient, and understanding them through that consideration. And it's like a new way of considering. Yeah. Well, anyway, so let's kind of explore. So we've got Reich working in this field and giving us a simple tool, a simple analytical tool with which to inspect our own lives, to inspect our own sexualities, our own drives. Now, if anybody out there has ever studied psychology or psychiatry, I would dearly love to know if you have ever heard the name Wilhelm Reich associated with your particular field of study. People that should know about the work of Wilhelm Reich are in fact learning the work of Wilhelm Reich if they're learning cognitive behavioural therapy.
Yes.
And who have never heard of him.
Well, they
his
burned
name
his
has
books
been
and everything,
obliterated. from the record books. Okay, this is the man that Freud called the father of psychotherapy, the most powerful healing tool known to mankind, talking therapy.
Yeah.
Yeah? And his name has been eradicated. In fact, I mentioned on Johnny's show that, in fact, trying to find a translated copy of one of his original manuscripts is virtually impossible. And my copy of his biography came with pages removed that have been removed by the American authorities. And as a counterpoint to that, we have the Kinsey report. This previous section about Reich and about how his work has been hidden, obfuscated, plagiarised, and just simply his name has been hidden from the record as much as humanly possible. And in its place, we have the Kinsey report, the famous so-called first ever scientific research, widely, with a huge sample about human sexuality. And we have the Kinsey report, which is supposedly the scientific analysis and conclusions that Kinsey drew from this questionnaire system that he put into place. And from the Kinsey report, we have all sorts of common public misconception memes, which still to this day persist, and I really don't understand how or why. Possibly because they're so attractive to the uninformed mind. They're nice simple ways of thinking. Oh, you know what I mean? They're a puff. You know what I mean? They're this, they're that. And nice little categories within which to pigeonhole people and not have to think about awkward things like sex, and especially what other people do in the bedroom, which seems to alarm most people to the nth degree. But anyway, this Kinsey report has basically been relied upon in the public mainstream media as the primary source of all wisdom and statistics about the field of sex and sexuality.
I call bullshit on it.
We both call fucking bullshit on it. Kinsey was a pervert of a magnitude order, unlike anything that we can really imagine. It would appear that he possibly studied a lot of the work of Mengele, the Nazi death doctor from the death camps. Certainly was hugely interested in Mengele's statistics about pain thresholds and responses to violence and trauma. And he actually went on in his publicly published work to essentially torture and sexually abuse babies and write down the results. It's out there. Anybody that wants to go look this up, go look it up. It's out there. This guy was a serious, twisted, I would go so far as to say, a violent abuser of children who was looking through his scientific work and through his public persona some way of justifying his own monstrous behaviour.
And he's bloody well respected, and that's the scary thing.
He absolutely, and still referred to.
Still referred to.
Which, you know what I mean? Anybody that wants to refer to his work, if they just refer to the Kinsey report and don't look a little bit deeper. I mean, to be quite honest, some of this is actually in the Kinsey report. It's anonymised. Some of it, the paedophilia stuff, he was actually sponsoring convicted paedophiles to pursue their pedophilia and to make fastidious notes. He's actively encouraging convicted paedophiles in the public domain to pursue and actively document their pedophilia.
Yeah.
So, I mean, under the 1 in 10 fraction of abused that go on to become abusers, Kinsey, in his creating his report, was probably responsible for creating an exponential production, not only of traumatised victims, but also traumatised victims that then went on to create the abuse themselves.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And sorry, Sean, and this is really what drives my desire to rewrite the public language, and especially the use of paedophile, the public use of language using Kinsey-esque statistical research, and especially using Kinsey's conclusions that he drew from those researches.
Yeah. Well, what really, really pisses me off, and it really offends, it's so offensive, is that his most acknowledged and accepted stuff, research, is offensive to all males. It's totally offensive to say that. I think on his scale says that he thinks that 99.9% of all men are both heterosexual and homosexual. At some time in their life, they are both. And I'm thinking, hang on, this is accepted. I am really, really aware of my heterosexuality. And it's very upsetting that generations and generations of people through this bullshit have been even asked to inquire within themselves about whether they're homosexual or not. Now, I'm not saying that I'm against homosexuality. I'm saying if one knows one's sexuality, then go ahead and be that person one is. But